Now think of this. Okay, think of this. Cells, most of the stuff that cells need to do, whether it's cell movement, synthesis of molecules, making the biological polymers like proteins and polysaccharides and what have you, cells have to do that stuff. The majority of things cells need, and getting ions across membranes or whatever, the majority of things cells need to do are endergonic processes. They require energy. And many, not all of them, but many of these processes are going to use ATP hydrolysis as a source of energy. Not all of them, but most of them. So what that means is cells have to constantly make ATP. And some, especially metabolically active cells, think of the cells in your central nervous system. They are burning ATP as fast as they can produce it. So you shut the ATP production off, they start failing to operate, failing to send nerve signals in as little as 15 to 30 seconds, and they start dying in as little as 2 minutes. Most cells have a little bit more ATP stockpiles than that, but cells run on ATP as much as your car runs on gasoline. So the question is, in order to make that ATP, you have to take a phosphate, an ADP, and do that condensation reaction. That's endergonic. It takes energy. So the question is, we need to get some form of energy to generate ATP. And cells are going to have to get that from the outside world. They're not a closed system. They have to take something in that generates the energy they need to make ATP. And that's the whole idea of our energy-producing metabolism. So what we have to do is use molecules or some kind of energy or whatever from the outside to power the production of ATP. Now, how cells do that is in a number of different ways. But one of the things that's a fairly common thread in energy-producing metabolism is doing the process of oxidation. Oxidation is where you remove electrons from something and pass them to something else. That something else that gets the electrons is what we call being reduced. So we're going to take electrons from things and pass them to something else. In many cases, of course, the term oxidation first referred to reacting with oxygen. And many oxidation reactions do just, including the ones in our own body, do just that. They take electrons from something and pass them to oxygen. Reason why, oxygen is second only to fluorine in how electronegative it is. It loves to take electrons from things. So it's very easy for oxygen to oxidize things, remove electrons from stuff. And we use that in our metabolism. Not all organisms do, but we do, and most organisms do. So oxidation. Now oxidation is an exergonic process. It releases, for the most part, there are a few exceptions, but for the most part, it releases energy. So one thing we're going to do in most energy-producing metabolism, not all, is we're going to oxidize something. We're going to take electrons from something. That will release energy, and that energy release can be captured to make ATP. Another thing that we see that's a common thread in these is the use of nucleotide coenzymes. Remember, these nucleotide coenzymes, these modified double nucleotides, they pick up or they donate or receive electrons from other things. In other words, they are involved in numerous oxidation reduction reactions. These are things like NADH, FADH, NADPH. All of these things are intimately involved in our energy-producing metabolism. And they're so widespread and so universal that you can say these are probably fundamental properties of life on this planet. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if we actually found anything like life on Mars or whatever and looked at their biochemistry. I wouldn't be surprised if they used something similar, maybe not the same molecules, but something very similar that could be used to easily donate or receive electrons. So that's another kind of comment. Now, a wide range of organisms use quite a number of different metabolic strategies. Let's take a little quick overview of some of these. Some of these strategies are really quite bizarre, but also quite important in the global environment. So let's take a look at a few things. We can break energy-producing metabolism down to a couple things. One is what we would call the heterotrophs. What they do is they take organic molecules from the outside, break them down, usually by oxidation, and that produces the energy you need to make ATP. That's what we do. In other words, they eat. What do we do when we eat? We eat organic molecules, sugars, polysaccharides, lipids, proteins. Any of those things can be used as an energy source. So, a lot of organisms from many different bacteria do that, fungi do that, animals do that, even plants do that, but they also have another strategy. So that's one kind of thing. The other, what we call the autotrophs, literally self-feeding. What they do is they make their own energy-rich organic molecules from things like carbon dioxide. In other words, these are our photosynthesizers. And real cruelly and really simply, light is a source of energy, carbon dioxide is a source of carbons and oxygens, and they synthesize glucose. That's what all photosynthetic organisms do. They make their glucose. They store the glucose, and then when the lights go out or whatever, or winter comes along, they can metabolize it by the same strategies that we do. So plants not only photosynthesize, but they also do the same kind of stuff that we do as well. Okay, that's another thing. A third one is what we call sometimes the chemotrophs. We'll take a quick look at it because they're kind of interesting. Now with the photosynthesizers include plants, some protists are photosynthetic, like the euglena we looked at in the lab, and there are photosynthetic bacteria. The most common kind are called cyanobacteria, blue-green bacteria, because their chlorophyll's a little different color. It's a blue-green in color compared to the olive-green that normal chlorophyll is. Okay, so those are photosynthetic organisms. The chemotrophs, what they do is they take either very simple organic molecules or inorganic molecules, do chemical reactions on them, and they get a little bit of energy out. Not a huge amount. It's not a great way to live. None of these reactions are terribly energetic, but they allow these organisms to live in environments that no other organism can do. So, now, no eukaryotic organisms do that. This is limited to certain types of bacteria, not all that many of them either, and certain types of archaeans that do these chemotrophic strategies. Now, like I say, it's not a great way to live. None of these reactions that we're going to overview in a few moments really generate huge amounts of energy. But it's enough to keep a low energy, not terribly active organism just barely alive, and allows them to live in environments where no other organisms can, which is nice. You don't have to worry about competition. You're on your own then. So let's take a little look at these. Once again, these are microbial strategies. You can take microbiology, I'm sure you can get a lot more of it. But there's a number of different kinds of widely used strategies that organisms can do. Some organisms can use metal ions as a food source, for instance, iron being the most common. You take electrons away from iron and pass them to something else. That's exergonic. Not very, but it's a little bit exergonic. In other words, you kind of rust things. Others can use copper. Some can use zinc. A few can even use chromium, which is toxic and carcinogenic to most organisms. But abundant metals such as iron and copper, those are the most widely used. You find organisms like that living in things like mine tailings and runoff and stuff like that, where you get all kinds of toxic metal ions leaching into the environment. They live in places that would be highly toxic many times to most organisms. But, on the other hand, they got the environment all to themselves. So that's one kind of thing we have. If you like to live near volcanic vents and things like that, you can take this strategy, sulfur oxidation. You start out with hydrogen sulfide, rotten egg gas. It's put out in volcanic vents. It's called rotten egg gas because that's exactly what it smells like. Okay, you take electrons from it and you can turn it into elemental sulfur. Many of these organisms in anaerobic environments, that's where it stops. They take hydrogen sulfide and deposit elemental sulfur and excrete the stuff. In fact, it's now believed that many of our commercially mined sulfur deposits were actually biogenic, produced by microbes that use this kind of strategy. Now, there happens to be some oxygen around. You can carry it further all the way up to sulfate ions. And even to sulfuric acid. There are some organisms that excrete sulfuric acid and can live in concentrations as nasty as battery acid. Now, how many organisms like to live in battery acid? That stuff will burn your clothes and skin if you get on it. But for some organisms, that's a pretty nice environment. Once again, these guys tend to live in volcanic environments, volcanic vents, deep sea hydrothermal vents. Another kind of group of microorganisms do exactly the opposite. They actually reduce sulfur. They'll start out with things like sulfate ions, and through a series of steps, release nasty, stinky, toxic hydrogen sulfide. You can find some of these guys living in things like sewers, sludge ponds, Congress, and sorry, I couldn't resist. They deserve it. They haven't done anything for 4 years except obstruct any kind of thing that happened to come up. So maybe they'll get a little better this time, otherwise they get outed in 2016. But at any rate, you know, here again, these guys tend to live in these fairly nasty environments. They produce hydrogen sulfide. In an ecosystem, if you have a huge proliferation of these sulfur-reducing organisms, what will happen is hydrogen sulfide, it's like water in many respects. Sulfur and oxygen are on the same column of the periodic table. Hydrogen sulfide, therefore, is polar and dissolves very nicely in water. Now, what happens if you have a big outburst of these guys, what will happen is you're going to end up saturating the water with hydrogen sulfide. And that poisons just about everything else. And then if you still produce more of it, it's going to come out of solution and into the atmosphere. Now, a little hint here. This may have had a big impact in the global environment. If you go back 251 million years ago, they dated it even more accurately than that. There was a mass extinction that wiped out in a matter of tens of thousands of years or less, that's as best the fossil record says, what they call the Permian Extinction, that wiped out 90% of all species on this planet, 70% of all genera on this planet, and like 60% of all families on the planet. Organisms that were successful hundreds of millions of years catastrophically died off. Afterwards, the Earth was pretty barren and a very nasty place before life kind of rebooted. Now, one of the possible causes of this greatest extinction event in the past 500 million years includes these guys. You had volcanic eruptions that, quote, spewed out carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that caused a pulse of global warming, maybe 5 degrees Celsius or so. And the lava just happened to be flowing. There's an area, it's in Siberia. Thousands of square miles, larger than the U.S. southeast, erupting for tens of thousands of years, flooding that whole area with lavas. Volcanic eruptions at a scale that we can't even imagine. Unfortunately, that lava was flowing right over a bunch of old coal beds. What happens when you take lava and coal and mix them together? If there's oxygen around, the stuff ignites. If there's no oxygen around, the coal breaks down into methane and other things. So what happens? More greenhouse atmosphere. You have a second pulse. In a matter of a few tens of thousands of years or less, the global temperature probably went up close to 10 degrees Celsius. That's like 18 degrees Fahrenheit. In other words, the climate here would be hotter than it is in South Florida. The climate in Toronto would be hotter than it is here now. That's the kind of change you're talking about. In a short period of time, that's going to be hell on ecosystems. So a lot of organisms die. The ocean circulations, the big currents and stuff, shut down, flow between the surface waters with oxygen and deep waters that don't have oxygen. We have that in our modern oceans. That's why there's oxygen throughout the whole water column. You go down 5 miles deep in the ocean, there's still oxygen in that water. Well, you shut that top to bottom circulation down, what happens? The oxygen in the deep sea runs out. Everything dies except for anaerobic organisms, and some of them include these guys. So they proliferate, saturate the water with hydrogen sulfide, killing off just about every kind of marine life you can imagine. The fossil record shows that only a limited number of species that their modern-day relatives are very tolerant to extremely nasty, polluted water survive that. And then these guys start pumping hydrogen sulfide out. Goes into the atmosphere. It starts poisoning stuff on land, tearing apart, breaking down. This is a good way of trashing the ozone layer, damaging the global ozone layer. Fossil evidence suggesting ultraviolet damage to plants around that. And marine and land ecosystems collapse. And results a devastated world. It took millions, 10 million years or more for the planet to recover from that. Of course, it's a little scary when you talk about the upper end of the scale of global warming that we're causing. Would that induce, if it goes a little bit too far or further than the model suggests, could that induce a second mass extinction of this magnitude? But it tells you about these kinds of anaerobic, chemotrophic organisms. Now, one other one we'll take a peek at, because these are also very important in global environment. What we call the methanogens, methane producers. Methanogens are done only by archaeans. Bacteria don't have this, aren't able to do this. But archaeans, which are prokaryotes but very different from bacteria. They look like bacteria, they smell like bacteria, but genetically and biochemically they are more closely related to us than they are to regular bacteria. That's why archaeans are put in one of the 3 domains of life. Archaeans, bacteria, and all eukaryotes. Those are the 3 domains of life. Plain. What these guys do, they take carbon dioxide and either hydrogen gas, or you can use hydrogen-rich molecules. Typically, acetic or formic acid are used if you want to use some organic molecules. They have lots of hydrogen. Through a series of steps, you produce methane, natural gas. Now, this does not release much energy. It's barely enough to keep these organisms alive. All of these guys are strict anaerobes. They are poisoned by oxygen. Oxygen is as deadly to them as cyanide is to us. You find these guys in lots of different environments. You find them in the bottoms of swamps. In fact, sometimes you see, if you go out to a swamp, or politically correct, a wetland, and you see bubbles coming up, those are methane bubbles. You throw a match on, they'll ignite. You find them in the bottoms of sewers and sludge ponds. Once again, bubbling up their methane, that's their wastewater. It's possible that some of our natural gas reserves were richly generated by these organisms. But most importantly, in the past, these guys may have kept the planet from ending up in a near permanent deep freeze. Because you go back about 3 billion, 3.5 billion years ago, there's no oxygen in the atmosphere. Absolutely none. Well, maybe parts per 1,000 or parts per million, but that's it. Certainly not enough for us to breathe. Anaerobic organisms are the only game in town because none of them need oxygen. Question?
What does it say in the parentheses?
Oh, acetic or formic acids. They can use that too. Okay, and they make this methane. Methane bubbles up. Okay, so these guys are out there. And of course, in an anaerobic environment, all you need was carbon dioxide and a source of hydrogen and liquid water, and you're a happy camper. So mice have thrived in the early Earth. Genetic evidence suggests that methanogens are closest to the earliest types of life, the first forms of life that existed on this planet. So they were probably some of the first types of life that developed on this planet some 3.5 billion years ago. So now, they're pumping out methane in large quantities in the atmosphere. Methane is a powerful greenhouse gas. It's almost 25 times as potent as carbon dioxide. So you start throwing a few tenths of a percent or even 1% of methane into the atmosphere, you can have a massive global warming effect. And that was a good thing, because back 3.5 billion years ago, the sun was only 80% as bright as it currently is. If we had our atmosphere and the old sun 3.5 billion years ago, the average global temperature on this planet would be about what you find in Antarctica. The planet would be frozen over, pole to pole. But pump a few tenths of a percent of methane into the atmosphere, and lo and behold, that extra greenhouse warming keeps liquid water on the surface all the way till the sun warmed up to close to current levels. These guys may have literally saved the world from a long-term deep freeze that may have exterminated life before it ever got beyond the level of microbes. So, they're fairly important. The other interesting thing with methanogens is you can find them living underground in solid rock. Little tiny filaments, micrometers thick, surrounding the grains of a rock like limestone and stuff, can be a home for those stuff. And people have done sterile deep drilling and found numerous, a whole sparse ecosystem living in rock thousands of feet down, as far down as 2.5 miles. There's some estimates, though it's been disputed lately, that the total biomass of these underground microbes may equal the total biomass of everything on the surface and in the ocean. Well, that's been lately disputed. Now some calculation thinking maybe it's more like 10%, but it's still a significant chunk of stuff. Now, of course, the question is, did it happen on Earth? Could it happen on Mars? That's one reason why that Mars rover that just landed carries a very sensitive gas analyzer. Because one thing they wanted to do was see if there's methane in the Martian atmosphere. Unfortunately, the most recent data they released said if there's any, it's less than 5 parts per million. They're not quite sure if there's absolutely none, but if they do find methane, it could indicate the possibility that there's microbial life on Mars underground to this very day. But right now, it's not looking too promising. Okay, well, anyway, we will see you guys in the lab. Don't forget, set everything up, rock and roll. I'm going to turn this baby off.
All right.